Hi, I'm Alex from the Zscaler Customer Success Engineering team. In this series of short videos, we're taking a look at the baseline recommendations of the configuration of Zscaler Private Access. This video consists of a list of concrete recommendations for configuring different parts of ZPA, mostly focused on application segments and access policy. However, the first recommendation has to do with forwarding policy. Zscaler recommends that you enable ZPA on-premise by configuring the Zscaler Client Connector forwarding policy to tunnel ZPA to the Zero Trust Exchange, even when your users are in the office. By doing so, you'll gain full visibility into user application traffic and ensure that only authorized users can access only the applications that are assigned to them. This is especially important if you're still in the application discovery phase, as if you don't do this, users who are on-premise will no longer be accessing their applications to the ZPA, and you will be unable to discover and index applications that are accessed from within the corporate network. By forcing user traffic to go through ZPA to access configured applications both off and on trusted network, you ensure that you significantly reduce your attack surface and your risk of breach. The next few recommendations are to do with defining application segments. The first of these is to make sure you do not include port 53 in your application segments when configuring these, in order to avoid forwarding DNS through ZPA. Zscaler Client Connector performs its own lookup based on FQDNs to determine the available app connectors and select an optimal path when a user attempts to access an application. If this is skipped due to resolution via DNS, traffic will be forwarded using the resolved IP directly, which might cause reachability issues and other unexpected behavior for your application. So it's strongly recommended that you do not include port 53 from your application segment definition. Next, it's also recommended to avoid IP ranges when configuring segments. Generally, wildcard domains should be used instead. If wide IP ranges must be defined, it's recommended to remove these segments after a set period of time and rely on FQDN-based definitions for application segments. This provides you more precise access control and reduces your attack surface. Next, it's important to understand that wildcard segments should generally be seen as a short-term solution, primarily designed to allow for application discovery. The use of wildcard segments in production after the initial discovery period should be avoided, as these increase your attack surface by allowing open access to many applications at once, rather than building a zero trust application access policy. It's recommended that you replace your wildcard/discovery segments with defined application segments no more than 90 days after initial deployment in order to reduce your attack surface and the risk of a breach while providing better access control to your applications. Finally, for application segments, it is heavily recommended that you use the AI-generated recommended application segment feature in order to further segment your applications. This feature will generate application segment suggestions which are based on application access patterns and end user behavior. For example, applications that are often accessed by the same users who share criteria such as group or department membership will be grouped together into suggested segments. This will allow you to easily find applications that should only be accessed by certain users, create segments for those applications, and create access policy that restricts access to just those users for just those applications, allowing you to achieve microsegmentation and the corresponding zero trust application access. Note that here it's recommended to start with department as the initial SCIM attribute used for groupings. After the initial segmentation policy is implemented, you should change this attribute to group in order to get more granular segmentation recommendations, as a user can be part of a single department, but up to 1,000 groups. Next, here are some recommendations for defining access policy. The first of these is to create specific access policy rules on a one rule per use case basis. The goal here is to make sure that all access policy rules are unique in purpose and access requirement, to make policy more secure and policy management less ambiguous. This will make managing your access policy easier and also help identify the owners of specific applications, which helps ensure that application segments are kept up to date. The primary benefits here are a reduced risk of outage due to misconfiguration and a reduction in the time required to implement a change or fix an issue with your access policy. Next, it's heavily recommended that you leverage the device posture feature to control and secure access to your applications. For example, by creating a policy to limit access to business-critical applications to only compliant corporate managed devices. Device posture can distinguish between various device states and configurations. Most typically, for example, is a user device corporate managed, i.e. does it have a client enterprise certificate installed or specific registry values pushed to the device by GPO, versus is it a BYOD device with the default security setup. It can also check the presence of certain security requirements, such as is there a specific antivirus or antivirus running, is the OS version up to date, and so forth and so on. As a general rule, it's recommended that you configure an access policy rule blocking access for all non-compliant devices near the very top of the access policy rule list to ensure that non-compliant devices are not allowed to access your corporate applications. Along the same lines, you should also try to leverage the user risk score as part of your ZPA access policies. User risk score assessment analyzes user behavior in real time to estimate the risk for the business from the user's behavior. These results can be used to define dynamic access policy rules. Defining more restrictive rules for users with a higher critical risk score can help with early detection and blocking of compromised users, as well as highlighting irresponsible behavior on the user side. Next, it's recommended that you have specific app connectors dedicated to specific application segments, and that when creating access policy rules, you lock those rules to those specific application connectors. Selecting specific application connectors or server groups with an access policy will ensure that if these connectors are down, users will not be able to access these applications via other connectors. This increases both security, as users will only access specific applications via the specific connectors you've chosen to do so, as well as reducing the risk that user traffic will be routed through suboptimal paths. Another configuration that you can use to provide better security for your applications is to configure timeout policies that match the security level of your applications. The default timeout policy that comes pre-configured inside ZPA forces a re-authentication every 7 days for all users. This is fine for general access, but it lacks granularity for a zero trust application access model. It's recommended you define different timeout policy rules based on your corporate security policy, and then select these timeout policy rules when configuring access policy for more critical applications. This will force users to re-authenticate more often when accessing critical apps, reducing the risk that a compromised user account will access a business-critical application. Note that selecting which segments or users a timeout policy applies to is done when configuring the timeout policy, not the access policy. If you have the Zero Trust Browser or Browser Isolation license module, it's also recommended that you configure browser isolation for applications accessed by third parties. As discussed in the previous video, browser-based access segments can be configured to go through browser isolation, which creates an isolated container maintaining the session on behalf of the user while streaming pixels to their device. Browser isolation controls can then allow you to restrict download or upload, copying and pasting, and other methods of interacting with the local device. This will isolate unmanaged devices from business-critical data while users are still enabled to perform their duties. One final recommendation for access policy is to monitor requests that hit the default block rule. The error SE policy is not configured for access is generated when no matching access policy for a requested application is found, which means access was blocked by default. By reviewing the corresponding log entries in Analytics Diagnostics, you can identify users who should have access to an application, or failing that, users who should not be attempting to access an application they don't have access to. This will allow you to create access policy where necessary, as well as monitor applications for unauthorized access. The benefits here is that authorized traffic flows are enforced by specific rules, reducing your attack surface, and that your SOC will have better visibility into unexpected flows due to reduced noise. Remember also to configure LSS to be able to forward ZPA logs to your SIEM. Finally, one recommendation specific to application segment health checks. When configuring an application segment, there are 3 possible options to pick from health reporting. If you pick none, connectors are assumed to always be able to reach the application. This is not recommended as users may be routed through connectors that can't reach your application. If you pick continuous, probes are performed continuously. This is also not recommended as this generates a high load on both the connectors and the application. The recommended option for health reporting in application segment configuration is on access. This will perform health checks on every request, plus 30 minutes after the access attempt, which will guarantee health monitoring for your application segments without impacting your applications or your connectors. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching.